So welcome to the Forest Protection Forum. The Forest Protection Forum is a monthly event that is facilitated by the Stop Clearcutting California campaign. The Stop Clearcutting California campaign is a campaign that's part of Sierra Club California. And it started with a focus on really stopping clearcutting in California, educating people with the reasons that clearcutting isn't a good idea, and talking about the benefit and value of forests. In addition, the campaign has expanded itself to also talk about the values of old growth and mature forests. And we have definitely participated in campaigns by the Climate Forest Campaign on behalf of old growth and mature forests. And the campaign has also developed a focus on stopping the GSNR pellet plants being developed in California and educating the public about the harms of forest biomass incineration. So those are just some of the things we focus on. We are very, very delighted to have Chuck Willer here today, and Jennifer Normal is going to introduce him.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Chuck Willer is a prominent figure in Oregon's environmental advocacy. As the co-director of the Coast Range Association, he's been at the forefront of grassroots efforts for 29 years. The Coast Range Association is a nonprofit organization, and it has been working since 1991 to find just protections for Western Oregon's forests while supporting a vibrant rural economy. Chuck's work spans research efforts on coastal forestry, watershed conservation, and public lands management, as well as on the economics of forestry and agriculture. His many accomplishments include helping to create the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board in 1994, contributing to a bibliography on the climate crisis and the Green New Deal response, and testifying at a timber severance tax information hearing before the House Committee on Agriculture and Natural Resources. His dedication to environmental issues is also reflected in his educational outreach, where he's developed materials such as informational memos and posters characterizing the timber industry. Chuck Willer's commitment to transforming Oregon's forests into climate and people-friendly environments is evident through his advocacy for increasing stored forest carbon on corporate-owned industrial forests while providing social benefits to forest workers and rural communities. And we are so glad to have you here today to speak to us. And before I turn things over to you, I'm just going to mention that we'll have a presentation by Chuck, and then hopefully ample time for a Q&A. If you just want to make a comment, put that in the chat. If you have an actual question, please put that in the Q&A. We appreciate it. Thank you. And Chuck?
Thank you.
It's all yours.
I'll see if it will go from the beginning here. Come on, there we go. Now, I don't know if you want to take some of these screens off or mute your video so the more of the slides on. So I'm seeing Karen Pitts and Darlene Scanfeld and Kristen are all on there. But I don't know what you're seeing.
Yeah, Chuck, we can each control what we see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's go. So, yeah, Jennifer saw a 14-slide presentation I did as part of an intro on a watershed little presentation the Oregon Sierra Club Forest Group hosted. And in those 14 slides, there must have been something that got her excited and thought there was some value in having me here today. I think I know what some of those slides were. all I was doing was presenting a sliver from a larger slideshow that I did a month earlier, which was just part of a 55 or a major slideshow that was about an hour and a half presentation. So, and everything that I talk about in this thread is really about a half a day seminar. So what you're going to get is just a brief taste of what I've been working on, some of what I've been working on in the past couple of years. So let's just spin through some things. I like to start out, you could apply this to anything. Chomsky's quote, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum." That's really a good characterization of a lot of Oregon's policy circles. And the sideboards are pulled in pretty tight by the powers that be. But what I'm going to briefly visit here actually is a story arc that goes from 1989 to 2024, where I started out in watershed issues and forest issues, and wanted to get to the bottom of why forest lands were managed the way they were managed in our private industrial landscapes. And I couldn't quite understand why they did practice such destructive forestry, including losing a lot of production by cutting too quick, losing a lot of profit by cutting bad small trees, and yet there was something else going on driving their management. And in 1989, I was very aware of watershed issues and stream issues and things like that, at the same time focusing on federal land management. And then in 93, I ran into Rich Nawa and Chris Fursell. Some of you have probably heard of Fursell. He's done major work in the High Sierras on aquatics and watershed issues. But they had an interesting, they were doing an interesting work, which was scour and redeposition of stream bed load during storm events. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. I've never heard anyone else mention it. But if you go down to a stream and it looks nice, and you know there's salmon reds in there and salmon eggs, and then you come back after a storm, and if you check, the salmon eggs are all gone, but it looks the same. And that is because during the storm event, the fast running water has removed the gravel. And then as the storm slowed down, it redeposited the gravel, and you'd never think anything happened. But what happened is that storms increasingly were sending very flashy floodwaters down into the watersheds. And the salmon crisis by 1995 was here in full measure. Northern California too, the coho, all the 23 salmon stocks in the Pacific Northwest were put up for listing, or at least proposed for listing, and eventually were. And I just, so that's what I was really focusing on. Why do the big industrials manage their land like this when it's really not good business? And over a period of 15 years, I drilled into how big firms manage big money. And timber is a very capital intensive business, and they are not managing for the most profit. They are not managing for the most timber or production. They're managing for the highest rate of return on the capital they have invested. And so that really, once we had established that, and we did a number of reports, Forest at Work, a comparison of different regimes, et cetera, forestry regimes. In 2001, we did other reports, other analyses, but I was never really happy with understanding what's driving not just the management of timber, but other things that were popping up in all of our lives. And then I came across Friends of the Earth International, a little diagram where they had an iceberg. And then they talked about events, patterns, structures, and systems. This was a couple of years ago. And it really drove home for me where I needed to go to complete this story arc in my career. We deal with events every day. Clear cuts happen, herbicides are sprayed by helicopters. My work on ownership teased out some important patterns that needed to go public. And we started understanding the structures of forest ownership, the real estate investment trust and the timber investment management organizations. But the systems behind this transformation in the timber industry and other parts of our lives is all being driven by something. And I didn't see anyone talking about it. I didn't see economists talking about it, etc. And so, you know, at first I did look through the economics textbooks, the mainstream books. It's not in there. And in fact, if you look in Manku's microeconomics, things like debt, banks, and money aren't even discussed. And so I had to look at a broader economics than the mainstream economics. And here is a internationally used online free economics workshop or course, and it's called Core Econ. And it explains capitalism as private property, markets, and firms. And that's typical mainstream economics. And the book, Reclaim Economics for Future Generations, explicitly critiques the mainstream economics. And what's always missing? What's always missing is the discussion of coercion that's rampant through the institutional structures, the violence that's part of empire and the global economic system. And they don't mention capital, which is kind of interesting if they're explaining capitalism. And I thought, well, that's the issue that I wanted to know because industrial forestry is capital intensive, and it's the capital return that drives its management. So I had to look deeper. And what you basically get to, and it doesn't take long, is command and control by finance capital. And what I wanted to know deeper, the wheels and gears, was how does this invasive capital, which is you see the theme showing up in sci-fi movies all the time, of something's invading your community. And I think it's a lot of metaphor for what the invasive capital that's into every community now and doing something that people are unhappy about. And we'll visit a few of those some things. For one, emergency rooms being taken over by venture capital. Private equity owns a quarter of all ERs now. I don't even get how that works. 27% of private homes being bought by hedge funds. This is really disturbing to younger people who are trying to buy a house. And you know, that's just another example. This one in ProPublica, this expose, how the visionary hospice movement became a for-profit hustle. Again, equity moving in. Secret equity moving in and gaming the systems because they take over what used to be kind of benevolent businesses. And then the thing that got me in 2016 into 2019, I did ownership analysis of every parcel of land in Western Oregon. And what you see in red are the Real Estate Investment Trust and the Timber Investment Management Organization's invasion of Western Oregon private forests. What's in purple are still the integrated traditional forests, but they manage on a financial basis, as everyone does, since George Weyerhaeuser showed everyone that's the only way to manage forests. So I was motivated by forests, but I started noticing all kinds of things were being transform by capital. And controlled by who? Well, there's 57,000 venture capital firms, 25,000 secret equity firms. They're not called secret equity firms in the literature. That's my term. And you can read all about these, and you can find out who everyone is on a website called PitchBook. And if you pay $25,000 for a yearly subscription, you can have access to all these folks and pitch to them. Now, what they're working on is on behalf of wealth and power. And if this little graph, which is from the Federal Reserve, they put these out every quarter, is how much the top 1/10 of 1%, the top 1%, the top 9, the next 9%, the next 40%, and the bottom 50% own of wealth. You basically see the bottom, you basically see here the blue, the teal look on the bottom. That's the middle class. That's the 40% of people that are under the top 10%. The lighter blue is the top 9%, and the drab green and olive green at the top is the 1%. The bottom 50% of people have really no wealth. So they're not even on this graph. Now, the way they do this, by my research, is through assets and legal modules. This is all explained by Professor Pistor at Columbia. And assets, which are neither here nor there, get turned into capital through these legal modules. And if you have a big deal you want to do in Hong Kong or Dubai, Rio de Janeiro, or wherever, the contracts for the deal will be adjudicated in the contract. It will say either in the state of New York's law or the city of London's law. I didn't realize that, but it just shows how concentrated and controlled things are. Now, I went into, as I am wont to do, to look at the nuts and bolts of how this thing actually works. How does secret equity and venture capital actually work? And it actually conforms to a turbofan jet engine, which is, I guess, a little humor on my part that most people wouldn't get. But what happens is that investors put in money, banks put in money, the law exists and the money exists, and then contracts are drawn up. So somebody gets an idea in a hedge fund or a venture capital firm, and they solicit the money. What's interesting about most of these solicitations is that the investors put in about 35, and then about 65% is borrowed money. Now, this means that I'm not even involved. One, I don't have any big money that typically goes into these deals. But the idea that banks put money into these things, that kind of turbocharges the whole thing. And what they do is create funds that are then ready to be an attack force targeting a set of businesses. It could be the emergency room, it could be some hospitals, it could be houses in Portland, Oregon, or wherever. And the private equity guys, the secret equity guys, they've got a business plan. They're selling the investors. And the plan basically will pitch maximum growth, an exit strategy, and then maximum profit and return upon exit. And this is the system that's loose and active. And it has grown every year, particularly since 1980. Now, part of understanding how this whole system works is how banks create money, issue credit, and service wealth. And that's a whole component I can't even go into. The strategy that the system works under is to deploy and attack. The term they actually use for their money is called dry powder. They'll have 500 million, 700 million of dry powder ready to go It's money that they can use immediately, and then they can go after. It might be a forest track in Oregon, it might be whatever. And they're going to control. They'll destroy a lot in the business. They'll get rid of what they would consider dead wood, obsolete this and that, maybe unions, maybe the contracts, etc. Then they'll rebuild a more, quote, efficient organization, increase profits, buff it up, hide the warts and things, and they'll want to eventually then have an exit sale for final profit. When Wall Street attacks, this is my view of what they're doing. They're basically taking hostages, their businesses and firms, and I mean, they're not, these are serious people with serious money. And it's all sold under a narrative of creative destruction. This has been a narrative for decades, and it's the destroy and rebuild part of what so-called entrepreneurs do, but it's not really entrepreneurs anymore. It's hedge fund teams and capital project teams. And they exit and deliver the final return. And the people put in their money because they're going to make a lot of money. Unfortunately, in the past years, bankruptcy is more often than not the exit strategy, and then as something wipes out the investors. Now, how the system works in a whole is there's a little model from heterodox economics, not mainstream economics, and that I made out of what I read. And the provisioning, they consider the society and the economy a provisioning system. Very totally different narrative than mainstream economics. There's the business enterprise, the working class of production and reproduction, and the capitalist core of investment control, and I would add banking and money creation. I don't know where these red lines come from, if you can see them, but it's kind of interesting that they're showing up. And in the middle of the whole economic system, as the heterodox and post-Keynesians would see, is the beneficial owners of wealth and the management firms, the firms I was just describing, and banking and money creation. That's the core. And this is the core that never gets talked about that I see, even by left groups, by the more radical enviro groups. Now, the reason I wanted to get to this level is this is the level that animates causality. This is where the causal chain begins and gets set in motion for whatever it is you want to be concerned about. And basically, they do it through gaining control of many of the 6 million businesses. And if you want to know more about what this core does, if you look at the North American industry classification system, it's a classification system for all 6 million businesses, or 12 million, depending on how you define the units. And Sector 52 is finance, insurance, and then real estate. And if you look at Sector 52, there's where you can actually see the listing of all the firms and how many in the various categories. And that's what I call Capital's Power Core, Sector 52 of the North American Industry Classification System. And this is a graph I got from a Canadian nonprofit, and this explains a lot. So if you believe what I just described, these capital investors loose in the world, getting out there, taking over, stripping assets, maximizing this and that. In 1980, global capital was about 12 trillion, and global GDP, it was about 120%. Global capital was about 120% of global GDP. And that expanding green circle compared to the gray circle is how capital, this money finance, and wealth has grown to 300 in 2010, 316% of global GDP. And today it's about 500%. So if you wonder, like, why are these folks showing up today and buying the houses, buying hospitals, buying everything under the sun, is that their wealth, the liquid wealth, the money, has grown so gigantic, whereas the economy, how many homes and how many factories and how many warehouses, hasn't grown in the same proportion. And this is the system that I think the smarter economists would have known would come when you dismantle the framework that Ronald Reagan dismantled and created the laws and the tax structure that he created. And he set in motion over the next 40 years, the neoliberal era. And these on the right are just some of the mainstream economist schools. And on the left are the post-Keynesians, institutionalists, Marxist and radical economists, and they all have been synthesized in the past 15, 20 years into a heterodox economics that I think explains a lot, and it's what I've discovered, really beneficial to understand things. And if you want to know more, I would suggest accessing Real World Economics Review online for free. A lot of the thinkers in the non-traditional economics publish in this. A special issue that recently came out had a great piece by James Galbraith Jr. down out of Texas, and this one by Newell, Economics as if Ecology mattered is really important. All in this issue is it's all there, it's all free, and you can do it. You can read it. So I would recommend this if you wanted to get up to speed on the kind of economics I'm talking about. Certainly these folks that are scholarly and right do not use the graphics I do, but that's because I'm not beholden to a career in economics. And I just kind of end here with the motivation to understand what's driving things comes from the three things I mentioned in every presentation for probably the past 4 years, and that is the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, which is really how I started my career 30 years ago, and the protection of habitat, and social crises that are now too numerous to really mention, but they're everywhere. And these three phenomena are what drive me to get out of bed and read something and try and understand it deeper and communicate that understanding to folks. And whether I'm just need to intro Betsy Herbert on a small watershed issue or give a major talk myself that drills even deeper into all this, it's these three realms that I think we're up against. If it was not as existentially threatening, I don't think we maybe need to come to terms with this. We could just roll on as we've been rolling and maybe be happy. I don't know. And thank you. That's my granddaughter. So I guess I'd be happy to answer any questions or revisit any themes I brought up or try and untangle any confusion I conveyed.
Well, thank you, Chuck. That was incredibly instructive and a tad depressing, to say the least. Yeah, and so can you kind of funnel things down to the specifics of your interest in watersheds in terms of translating what you just told us to, like, how does that affect the water we drink? Is it just the way industrial forestry works that is having such harmful impacts on watersheds?
Well, I think if you read the scientist letters, scientist warning letters that Bill Ripple has organized, get signed down by 20,000 scientists. I think one came out about a year ago and said this is our second or third warning. They review a lot of issues at a global scale. The change in land cover, with the deforestation in Indonesia, Brazil, Africa, industrial lands in North America, the destruction of the forest in British Columbia, then coupled with capital intensive agriculture. Not so much necessarily because the farms are that capital intensive, although compared to when I was younger, they're huge and they are capital intensive, but the industries over them, the fertilizer, nitrogen, natural gas-based fertilizer firms, the service industries, the Monsanto types, all that infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, fossil fuel based, that's keeping agriculture pumping, that plus the what's happening to the forested regions is just tearing up the aquatic systems. You got to remember the landmark laws, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, etc. The Clean Water Act did not apply to point source. It did not apply to non-point source, which is forest and agriculture. And so the aquatic systems have really taken a beating. And I think I could leave it at there. We could do a whole talk about how that plays out, the dynamics, and you can drill in until you just got your eye stuck on a few dots, until you really have to step back and see how management is operating and how whole watersheds and systems are being impacted.
Okay, and thank you. Moving on to some of our audience questions. Craig Patterson, fellow Oregonian, asks, do you have any thoughts about why Oregon State continues to push industrial forestry when it's so clear that model destroys jobs in rural communities? It's a short boom followed by a protracted bust every time, no exceptions. So they are educating toward a future that no longer exists, and so it goes.
Well, I think the OSU, the School of Forestry, and much of its departments, not all, but much, are basically reflective of power and wealth. And you just walk around the School of Forestry, and the Dean's Suite is the Gustina Timber Dean's Suite. The signs for the industry that sponsors the classrooms and the hallways and the lecture halls are everywhere advertised in the school. And so they reflect the industrial mindset, the belief system, the financial belief system, and the School of Ag Economics, which underpins the kind of forestry they teach, is the mainstream economics that has nothing to say about capital. Doesn't have much to say about money and banks and debt. It's everything that's missing. But they have a lot to say about markets and private property and all the traditional rigmarole. And that's the OSU School of Forestry. You could scale it up to the Oregon State or all the major universities. And look who's on the boards. Oregon State has a bunch of investors out of Lake Oswego in the Portland area. So it's really, these universities are really privatized. And you're going to get, a private wealth and power story out of a lot of it. Craig knows that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know Craig knows that already, but I think he just probably wanting to hear your take on it as well.
Yeah.
So yeah. So, okay, and another participant who wished to remain anonymous asks, at what point do the parasites, economic, kill the host? Will the tipping point come when future generations realize they have no future, or before then? Any insights?
Well, I think Al Gore went wrong when he used the frog in hot water metaphor, and as why people will just sit there and wait. And I think that's because Al was a little before, well, he just didn't have certain economics he understood. And the amount of money and the lifestyle it will afford hedge fund managers who are fabulously wealthy and maybe know they're only going to live probably 20 to 30 more years. Yeah, you're not going to change. Now, they will invest in good things if they can make their money in it. And the system is designed really to be shaped by the weight of the past. Capital's previous, what it's anchored into, fossil fuels, traditional industry. Here in the United States, of course, we have a huge anchored into the military industrial complex. These things are not going to pivot to reality of what the children are going to face, and the grandchildren in particular. What I'm seeing, maybe I'm wrong, but what I'm seeing by the scientists is we've already lost the West Antarctic ice sheet. We've lost probably the Greenland ice sheet. It's all gonna, by the time those play out, be long after our era, my life. But just the implications from that are huge. And, power and wealth and lifestyle of those people, they don't wait in the line in the airport with my line. They go straight to their private jet, and they're just living in a bubble of comfort. And talk them. And I know how the timber industry folks, you just talk yourself into a narrative of it's false consciousness, reinforced by the folks out at the country club and the socials they go to. Oh, it's not as bad as these guys say. Oh yeah, they're overreacting. All the stuff, and a lot of people in the Sierra Club would hear. So that's my take on that. But yeah, they will take us off over the cliff. They're doing it.
And we'll get to we'll kind of save what is your solution question till the end. But I'll let you kind of germinate on that while I give you a couple of other questions that came through. So Tom Conlon says, Chuck, your critique is spot on. Are you familiar with Mariana Mazzucato's work, Reconceiving the Drivers of Value Creation? The book is called The Value of Everything, and demonstrating how public money is often manipulated to produce private profit.
Yeah, Mariana is excellent. She's at UCL in London, and she works with there was just a set of photos the other day. I don't know where I saw, maybe on X, of her, Kate Raworth, and Stephanie Kelton, each holding up two of the other two's books. Stephanie being big on modern monetary theory, Mariana having several books that are important, and Kate Raworth, donut economics. So I read those kind of books. I read books, post-Keynesian books, and Fred Lee's Heterodox is what I've been trying to read. Anwar Sheikh's massive book in 2017, Capitalism. Why not get a 1,000-page book? and, and try and figure it out. These are important. There's just a wave of important knowledge in the past 20 years as the mainstream narrative has been shown to be just thin, if not total BS. And they've used a lot of mechanisms to promote the mainstream narrative on economics and politics. For example, there's no Nobel Prize in economics. I don't know if anyone maybe thinks there is. There's the Bank of Sweden Prize in economics in honor of Alfred Nobel. And they bill that, and the media sells it as a Nobel Prize. And that elevates these certain economists way up. Probably 1 out of 3 merit a Nobel Prize, and 2 out of 3 are just ideological promotion of the neoliberal agenda. That's what we're up against. It's you know, it kind of sounds conspiratorial, but you know, at the highest level, these guys are, there's institutions, think tanks, sewing this all together with an agenda.
Yeah, I don't think you'd have a tough time convincing people on this call of that. Appreciate biodiversity says, first of all, hi, thank you for the enlightening talk. Do you see a trend in the use of solar farms as an excuse for deforestation? And we are seeing it happen in Massachusetts.
That's news to me. I'm not following the solar wind transition. What I do read, just like the other day, is that more than half of all alternative power installations last year happened in China. And I mean, China is just going to do it. They'll drive over your toes if they have to. And it doesn't surprise me that, yeah, there'd be some tree in a forested state. There could be some trees cut down, but it's not what I follow. It's hard enough to just spend time to try and figure out who the bad guys are and how do they get away with what they're doing. You know, what are the wheels and gears mechanisms? And how might we create a broader unity across various constituencies by being aware of the deeper unity of what we're against, the bad guys.
No caller.
Sorry, spam. Yeah, so that gets to our what is your solution question, but we'll wait on that a little bit. From Natalie Shuttleworth, my perception as a non-professional in forestry is that clear cutting is destructive, never a good idea. Is it still being taught and practiced?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not that there are not alternatives being taught and being practiced on some ownerships, close family held ownerships. And there's 2 ways to look at something that moves away from clear cutting. It's not just clear cutting, it's the frequency of the cutting. You know, if you clear cut a patch on a 500-year rotation, you wouldn't even know it happened. But no one, that's a ridiculous example. There is a company here in Oregon that owns some industrial forest land, and they've moved to a 100-year rotation. And but for the most part, they're just doing your financial rotation. So I always go out there and say, you know, these guys are not growing trees. Don't be confused. They're growing money. And that's what they're all about, is counting the dollars. They got all this nonsense like net present value, the discount rate, and optimization of various things. But it's basically a return on the sunk capital of the forest with some risk consideration. There are people that do better forestry. The knowledge of how to do better forestry And the encouragement to do better forestry by forestry extension here in Oregon is quite substantial. But it's the small woodland owners are one thing. The big industrials in Oregon and Northern California and the Southeast Timber Belt, which also happens to be the Black Belt, they just roll on based on growing money.
Yeah, and here on Stop Clearcutting California, that's we've been working towards getting a ban on clearcutting California 20 years and counting. Clearcutting is unfortunately alive and well. From Natalie Shuttleworth, I do not understand why hedge fund managers and other very wealthy folks do not seem to understand or care about the impact of their policies, actions on their kids, grandkids. Comments?
Well, you know, I think that would be something to study, the psychology of institutional people in very specific institutional loci, hedge fund managers, and what they do in the course of a day and what they talk themselves into. Now, maybe a certain amount of time ago, you just think maybe they were so high on coke, they couldn't think through global warming. But I would assume they've cleaned up their act and are thinking a little more clearly today. And what they're buying into is greenwashing narratives and investing in so-called green investing. Although for the most part, these green investments are not going to promise the same return. And they're showing to be rather fake very often. So I don't know. It's hard enough to understand what a hedge fund does in the universe of capital dynamics, then drop down and think, what's going on inside the mind of a hedge fund manager? I generally shy away from psychology. Being from Chicago.
Said to a Chicagoan, born and raised. Thank you. Okay, and is there anybody, Janine asks, so is there anybody there doing better than OSU? Is there any institution where they're doing it right? And are there any colleges who are educating more holistic? Who do we ally with to create change? Who we can ally with to create change?
Well, I've looked at, again, this is outside of my research. It's not to say I couldn't pull off and spend a couple of months researching educational institutions. It seems like some pretty good thought is coming out of the Boston area. There's any number of universities that have really good geography departments, political science departments. They, like Galbraith at the Texas, he's in the public administration department. He could never get in the economics department. And so you just got to find people in departments that are good where they are. Kansas City, University of Missouri, Kansas City is the hub for heterodox economics and post-Keynesian economics. That's one economic school I'd recommend to check out. And there's probably a few others that, is a little outside my lens. For those people who are looking for education on maybe how to do good, I don't know if academia is the place to look. I think, the School of Hard Knocks, left political theory on the street, and whatever, and just figuring it out yourself, reading the right books. It's not that difficult, but you do have to read and learn and be part of some group.
Okay. And are you familiar with Michael Hudson's, and what do you think of his economics?
Hudson's at Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City. He's done some very important work. He's got a fantastic life story that's on YouTube of him just rambling on about his life that I'd recommend to anyone. Coming out of St. Paul with Trotskyite parents and well-versed in Marxism, ending up on Wall Street and being hired by David Rockefeller at Chase to do research on how the US is handling its income and outflow balance of payments. And he says they didn't care if I was a Marxist. They just thought, you're the only one researching that knows about balance of payments at a time when nobody seemed to know it. It's hilarious to listen to Hudson's life story. Outside of his very serious academic work on the origins and use of debt and money in Mesopotamia, I believe. And I'll tell you a book I'm impressed with, although it could, is Graeber and Wennegro's book, The Dawn of Everything. I think there's some powerful economics in that, powerful lessons for people, and stories of really how most of humanity actually operated versus what the received wisdom in mainstream anthropology was until recently, maybe. So that's what I would urge people to. Hudson,
Well,
yeah, excellent guy.
Great. So we still have a number of questions. We're getting close to the hour, so at this point, I do want to put out Holly Smith's question about, do you have solutions for change? And then also ask you, Chuck, do you have a hard stop at the hour, or would you be willing to go past the hour a little bit to try to get to everybody's questions?
I thought it went to 5:30, so I don't have a hard stop.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Okay. We can go as long as you want. It just,
But
I
now,
want to be respectful, so, okay. So Holly Smith asks, and keeping in mind that some people have us from 4 to 5 o'clock. And, so only from 4 to 5. So I'll go to her question, which is about any solutions you can offer.
well, there's some good news to always appreciate. But first, I think I really think this organizing and being part of some community level organization, network, group that is making an effort to educate itself about what I talked about, getting into the dynamics of capital. You won't, a lot of the left it's funded by foundations avoids that level. And so try and understand how the dynamics works, where the causality is emanating from, and work in a community environment, educating as many people as possible. It could be just informally like with Sierra Club friends, or other environmental friends, or labor union people, or all kinds of elements that are grouped together and are reading some of this stuff. Then the good news is to understand that the system does have a tendency to want to melt down every once in a while. And what happened in 2008 with they acted pretty quick. But there's these contradictions and problems that feed back because it is a dynamic system. And so because it's dynamic, no one can really know the future. And we do know from the past that it screws up big time on a regular basis, sometimes catastrophically. And that could set off, at least some level of insurgency politically or whatever. The other thing is that the critique of capital, if you want to call it, and the left is on the ascendancy at a global scale. You won't read about it in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the US media. But if you look at Brazil, many other countries in South America, what's going on in Mexico, what just happened in France, and what's bubbling below the surface at a global scale, there's a lot of people that are catching on that the system is rotten. It feeds a few people. It's destroying the biosphere. It's destroying our future prospects through this climate crisis. And, there's just a lot more positive going on at a global scale than you would get a sense of here in Corvallis. I'll tell you that. And that's designed, that construction of what's going on by media and the dominant things is designed to make us think, oh, we can't win. There's nothing what we could do about it. Let's just kind of go for some sort of morsel next year out of the legislature. It's fine, but the crisis in biodiversity, extinction crisis, and the climate crisis, and all these social crises that are just stacking up. Something's got to give. It just can't. I don't know. I said to an engineer professor at OSU one time, I says, how long can they keep this thing going? And he said, if they can keep pumping the oil, we can keep it going. I thought, we'll see. Now, so that's my answer. Organize at the grassroots level. Know really good, deep economics, the good economics. Understand the system and where its power comes from, and wait and play to opportunity on it as it arises. Build on that.
Okay, wise words. As an Oregonian, if you pay maybe you don't pay attention to California politics, but if you do you have an opinion about the California climate bond recently approved by the legislature, and that will be on the November ballot?
California is a unique government entity for a reason that makes it is different than almost under the neoliberal era. And this is something that Mariana at UCL would talk about, is the undermining of government capacity to solve important problems. And it goes even deeper than that. It's hollowing out of government's belief that it can solve problems. Now, what makes California unique is that its government is embedded in the hydraulic agriculture. And wherever you have governments that service hydraulic agriculture and have to maintain a huge industrial water infrastructure, Egypt, China, historically, you have governments that can't afford to believe they can't get the job done. They have to get the job done and deliver the water and maintain the system. When I was in the Northridge earthquake, and I was right on top of it in the valley, and we were just visiting, went down to show the kids Disneyland, and I could not believe how organized the earthquake response was. It would just nothing like that would happen in Oregon or Illinois or anywhere. I mean, the repair of infrastructure, the response by state and city things was just astounding. So you've got a special kind of governance going on in California that is a lot more complicated and historically deeper than I can handle. And I mean, it's kind of you know, California in the United States is kind of like China to the world. Its government is grounded in doing infrastructure, servicing infrastructure. I don't know if that makes any sense. It takes a lot of government in California to keep that Cadillac desert going.
Okay. And are you familiar at all with the climate bond?
No, I'm not. I haven't followed at that
Okay.
level. I used to read, some of the California papers before they put them behind paywalls. And you could buy them at a newsstand, LA Times. But those days are over with. I get up in the morning and read The Guardian. And that's pretty weird.
Okay, from Greg Jacob. So much of Clatsop County is owned by private firms. Was it during the 1980s or earlier that the REITs and TIMOs purchased the forest land?
Clatsop County, for those of you in California, is the coastal county at the northern part of the state where the Columbia goes into the ocean. And it doesn't have a lot of public land. It has a lot of Clatsop State Forest, about 150,000 acres. And it was originally dominated by Crown Zellerback. Then Crown Z sold out to, I think, Sir James Goldsmith when he came out of England with his money, sensing opportunity in America under Reagan. And then he sold it to the Hansons, and the Hansons sold it to somebody else. And now it's owned by TIAA, the investment company that used to be known as doing teacher pension funds. And I'm sure someone on this call probably has a TIAA pension, but TIAA's investment arm now, Nuveen, owns the forest, the biggest forest property in there. Weyerhaeuser owns some. There's a local mill that's trying to buy forest land. So it is mostly a private landscape. And the aerial photo of TIAA, Nuveen, has, the rhetoric. You wouldn't believe the rhetoric. Their green commitment that they're telling the teachers and the funds that put money into them. But then when you look at the aerial photographs for their ownership in Clatsop County, you can't get around it. It's just hammered. And they had to get out of forests. What can I say?
Okay, from Sam Stearns, how do we counter the euphemistic use of ecological restoration and other innocuous terms which mask clear cutting and other industrial forest practices on public lands?
Okay, the old growth amendment that's out and applies to all the national forests. I think the website that identifies threats to old growth and mature forest, one of the threats that of the 7 that they identify is the lack of lumber mills. Now you gotta like, okay, and what's the logic there? There's a lot of weird nonsense going on out in the world. A lot of companies, a lot of industry sectors, they want to be green. There's a lot of venture capital money that believes they have to push for green solutions. You look at what's his name at BlackRock. He sends out his annual letter. I can't remember his name at the moment. You think some environmental person wrote the letter. Well, probably they hired some PR people with some environmental knowledge to write the letter, but there's a lot of push and rhetoric going on. But when it all comes down, and this is why I look at that core of finance, in finance dynamics, you got to deliver the return, or the folks with the money will move to another opportunity. They'll move their money where they're going to get their return. It's a system that has trapped itself, and to get out of that trap, that cycle, is going to be really hard. It has to be an external force that comes in and cracks the nut. Now, is that a Keynesian Roosevelt era 1930s intervention? Or is it something more left that the folks in France would talk about? But that nut has to be cracked and neutralized to stop that dynamic, which is rapidly sending us over the cliff. And when it demands, I haven't even raised the idea of degrowth or zero growth, anything Herman Daly ever raised. The dematerialization of the economy is not really happening. I just don't know how much longer it can go on. It's doubling every 23, 25 years. I don't know how you can double steel production, coal production. I mean, the whole production apparatus again, and then again, when what we've got now is burning the planet up and destroying the biodiversity. Can you imagine doubling what's going on? And Wall Street's core is going to drive that doubling. Well, that's a sweeping set of statements.
My husband is a physician who practices infectious diseases, and he's convinced it's all going to take care of itself when we get the bugs, we get the right bugs. COVID was not quite the right bug, but that's what he's convinced of. It'll all take care of itself. So if say you're a small investor who wants to create wealth to put towards donations to reputable charities. For such an investor, do you have any advice? The question reads, well, it also notes that I manage a charitable trust and do the investing. I do not invest in index or mutual funds that may contain fossil fuel companies or the likes of Monsanto. Instead, I've created my own portfolio. My focus is saving, protecting wilderness and wildlife, including natural forests. So any advice for this small investor?
Well, they're probably spending a lot of time doing research, trying to do good, investing in maybe the right companies that are good. I mean, there's 6 million companies out there, and all the good things that you want come probably from some of those companies. We don't make them at home. And, to invest in those kinds of things is good within the framework that all good is qualified by a broader narrative. And so that person's doing as good as they're going to do. One option, I think, for some people is to not invest anymore and just give away the principal. Run it down and give it away. And coastrange.org there was happy to take some of it. It'd be a lot of work to be that person. You got to know, and they got to be smart. They got to know when they're getting a story told to them and not. And that's smart person has to work hard. Yeah.
And in the end, we can, we only can do the best we can.
Yeah.
Comment, it seems that the incentives to cut down forests more and faster are growing all the time. The biomass energy industry converting forests to wood pellets for export, liquid profiles, etc. We're hearing about genetically modified trees to grow faster so that they can be called renewable. robots to cut trees to make the work faster and cheaper. It seems so unbelievably short-sighted, doubling again and again, as you say. And that looks like more of a very lucid comment rather than a question per se, just observation. So one final question, which I think was submitted maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, read, but won't JD Vance save us?
Won't who save us?
JD Vance, Donald Trump's
Yeah, you're
pick
talking
for
about
vice president.
the news today.
Yeah.
Well, it's looking kind of grim out there in the world of electoral politics in the US. And because our organization is 501c3, I'm not encouraged to analyze and make too many statements about the actual elected, particularly during the election cycle. But those models I was showing you, those diagrams of political economy, is really the frame that I try and study, and that's how the state, the ruling elite of the state, and the capitalist class, how they work together to keep it all going and keep the capital dynamic going. Okay, so if anyone out there is familiar with input-output analysis, this is a tip you can take to the bank if you're looking for a future job. So people that do input-output analysis, they're always happening in environmental impact statements. And they use a software called IMPLAN. And you have to read the big IMPLAN analysis, usually in a DEIS. If you want to make IMPLAN dynamic, here's my tip. Study tensor calculus and build it into IMPLAN. That's not a joke. It's actually how you'd have to do it. And if you're that smart, you'd probably be smart enough not to try it. So that's my tip of the day.
Okay. Well, and on that, we'll wrap it up. And this has been incredibly informative. And it's, the wealth of your knowledge and the depth of your knowledge really that really demonstrates why you're considered a polymath. So thank you very much, Chuck, for joining us today.
Take a look at coastrange.org, the industrial section. There's a bunch of reports that people may find interesting. Look around the website. Most of what I've done is on it. And none of this, what I talked about today, is captured on the website at the moment, but there's stuff there. And my email address is on the website. If anyone wants to email me, chuckw@CoastRange, I'd answer back. And if I didn't answer back, it wasn't because I meant to.
Okay, well, I now have a list of about 8 different things to look up. books and YouTubes and other things. So
Thank you very much for having me on. It was a pleasure. And
we really appreciate your presence. Thank you so much. And okay, so good night, everybody. We'll see you next month with another speaker that we will announce shortly.